to come in and we will get started. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss reimagining zoning to desegregate our communities. My name is Fabiola Alekwaku, and I am a project planner at Cambridge Redevelopment Authority in Cambridge, Mass. I am also the chair of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee of APA Rhode Island chapter. I am joined today by Annette Bourne, who is also a committee member, but most importantly, she is the Director of Research and Policy at Housing Works, Rhode Island at Roger Williams University. We wanted to have this dialogue today because one thing we need to be honest about is that our communities are still segregated. Our nation is still segregated. And even though there are no longer overt laws requiring racially segregated schools or communities, there are still systematic practices that lead to it, like zoning. And the first step to solving any issue is recognizing it, acknowledging it, talking about it, and in this case, learning from others who have started the work to addressing the issue. I assume many of us on the line today have at some point, at some level, recognized, acknowledged, and have talked about segregation, or you won't be here today. So today's conversation is mostly about learning from others. So in this case, Sara Bronin from Desegregate Connecticut, who have started the work. A quick agenda overview for today is we will spend 15 minutes watching a short documentary, Segregated by Design, then a presentation and conversation with Sara Bronin, the founder of Desegregate Connecticut, followed by a Q&A session. Before we get started, I would like to ask that you all use the Q&A function to ask questions and the chat feature for comments. If you are calling in, you can dial *6 to mute and unmute yourself and *9 to raise your hand. With that, I will pass it to Annette.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. Welcome, everyone. The documentary we are about to watch is based on the work of Richard Rothstein and his book, The Color of Law, which we urge you all to read if you have not already. Segregated by Design examines the forgotten history of how our federal, state, and local governments unconstitutionally segregated every major metropolitan area in America through law and policy. Prejudice can be birthed from a lack of understanding of the historically accurate details of this past. Without being aware of the unconstitutional residential policies of the United States that they enacted during the middle of the 20th century, one might have a negative view today of neighborhoods where Black Americans live or even of Black peoples themselves. We can compensate for this unlawful segregation through a national political consensus that leads to legislation, and this will only happen if the majority of Americans understand how we got here. We turn to this documentary and discussion to face the major challenge at hand, to educate fellow citizens of the unconstitutional inequality that we've woven in on behalf of our government and accept responsibility to fix it. Thank you for joining us.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, The history that was once well known, but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation. Racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment along White Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people at the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African-American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African-American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African-American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the 5th Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment, that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Well.
Yes, that's a package.
It is.
So I'm going to dive right into introducing and welcoming very gratefully our speaker today, Sara Bronin. Sara is a Mexican-American architect, attorney, professor, and policymaker who works to create and preserve great places. She is one of the country's leading experts in the areas of property law, land use, historic preservation, urban planning, and renewable energy. She holds an endowed chair at UConn Law School, and this academic year holds visiting positions at Yale University School of Architecture and the University of Pennsylvania's Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Sara has held national positions in academic associations and currently advises the Sustainable Development Code and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She serves on the board of Latinos for Heritage Conservation, and our purpose for inviting her here today is the leader of Desegregate Connecticut. She has also served as a visiting professor at the Sorbonne in Paris, as well as at universities in Switzerland and Korea. She was educated at Yale Law School as a Truman Scholar, the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and the University of Texas at Austin. A highlight during her law school career was clerking for then Second Circuit Judge Sonia Sotomayor, who is now on the Supreme Court. A seventh-generation Texan, Sara is a native Houstonian who grew up working in her grandparents' Mexican restaurant. I honestly tried to find things to cut out of that, but there was nothing I wanted to cut out. So welcome very much, Sara, and take it away. We did want to ask you to start with your general thoughts about the documentary and then connecting it to your work at Desegregate Connecticut.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I'm so close, but yet so far away during the pandemic. I look forward to coming back in person at some point soon. I'm beaming in, of course, from Hartford, our lovely capital city. So I will talk about that documentary, actually, because a lot of people have asked us, what's with your name? So the name of the coalition that and the effort I'm talking about today is Desegregate Connecticut. The title of the video that you just saw, Segregated by Design, really emphasized the issue of inequality and racial and ethnic discrimination. Our name has turned into a lightning rod. So you as planners, I'm sure many of you have been involved in planning and zoning reform efforts. And typically the name of those, if you've done them in your communities, is rezone town X or a new city plan for city Y. But it's not necessarily framed in with a kind of equity lens. Even though my background is as a volunteer here in the city of Hartford on the Planning and Zoning Commission and doing a lot of rewriting and of our zoning code and adopting a new city plan and a climate plan here. So my background is really in a very broad-based approach to zoning and planning. But when we started this effort last June, we really felt that we were motivated right now to do what we're doing with Desegregate Connecticut and focused on zoning reforms for equity reasons. While we know that there are other benefits of zoning reform, we honed in on this framing in part because we just thought that that was really the priority and the value through which all of our efforts should be viewed. So the question of what's with the name, I mean, Richard Rothstein in his book documents this vast history of segregation. And it wasn't just at the federal level it wasn't just at the state level, it wasn't just at the local level, it was private actors as well, and really reinforcing across different levels of government segregation. So we see that today. We see it in Rhode Island. I know you see it. Of course, we see it here in Connecticut, and I'll show you just exactly how. So thank you for teeing us off. So our coalition, so just moving on from that, our coalition is a group of nonprofit organizations and people, a couple thousand people on our lists and participating in our events, who really accept that land use laws have led to segregation. Many of us have drawn from Richard Rothstein's well-documented ideas, but of course there are many other people, scholars and organizations that have been working for fair housing for many decades. So our effort is really intended to be kind of like a campaign that helps the many people who have been trying to expose this issue for years gain a more prominent platform in the discussion about our policy priorities. So these are the members of our coalition. I thought I would just highlight a few of them. The Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association was one of the very first members. I'm a member of the APA here, but I was very grateful and surprised at how quickly the planning chapter here got on board with everything we were trying to do from the very beginning. They really saw this as an opportunity to live up to the AICP ethics code and to really accelerate planners' efforts in making this happen. We were also joined by the Connecticut Association of Zoning Enforcement Officials, often probably in Rhode Island too, a group that may not want to, or may be perceived as not wanting to rock the boat. But here we have real leaders at Casio that have contributed to how we think about the issues and how we've drafted our legislation. Similarly, the AIA, NOMA, ASLA, Landscape Architects, a Regional Plan Association, which doesn't reach to Rhode Island, but of course is our tri-state planning nonprofit, have all been a part of our project. There are affordable housing organizations as well as the Sierra Club, which is increasingly interested in zoning, and many other groups. So before I get to the proposals, I want to talk about how we develop them. So we do have this 68-member coalition. We started very organically, just again, conversations over last summer, and people just kept, organizations just kept joining. We're really glad about that. We've met one-on-one with nearly a third of the legislature. We've probably been invited to maybe over 50 at this point, community events, meetings, book clubs, really, you name it, and we've done it. And we've also held our own events with about 2,000, probably more attendees, mostly educational events, some get out the vote type events. Our overall strategy, our overall goal rather, is to change statewide zoning in legislation. Like Rhode Island, Connecticut has enabling authority that's enshrined in state statutes. That's really what we are looking at and seeing how we can improve it to enable more housing. There's lots of reasons to act. As I said, most of us were focused on equity when we started this effort. Of course, there are economic and environmental reasons to undertake zoning reform as well. I do encourage you to visit our website to see a bunch of links on each of these three topics. This is on the general background page called Why Act. But on the equity side, as Annette mentioned and Fabiola mentioned, segregation and zoning go hand in hand. So the history of that is well documented. We're fortunate to have many different groups that are documenting that link here in Connecticut. And it's not just a Connecticut problem. So nationally, land use laws lock in what is predominantly one kind of housing, a single family large lot housing. Connecticut has one size fits all zoning as well. Single family zoning, again, on very large lots. How do we know that? We didn't actually, well, we could have looked around Connecticut and seen there's a very large number of single family houses. We might have thought that that would suggest that there were a lot of single family zones. But we actually quantified it through a team effort of a number of planners, and students, law students, policy students, and actually a couple of architecture students in the mix, who analyzed 32,000 pages of zoning codes in the state and have mapped in the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, which is available on our website, all 2,600 zoning districts. And what we found is summarized in this slide and the next. 90.5% of land in Connecticut allows single family zoning as of right. You can see little distinctions here that there are different gradations of purple depending on the way that we categorize the underlying district. 2.3% of land in Connecticut allows for 4-family housing as of right, and you can see that it's largely concentrated in urban areas and in low-income areas. As for the quantity of large lot single-family zoning, 99.5 of districts that we categorize as primarily residential allow for single family zoning. The minimum lot size in the vast majority of that land is about 1 acre or more. As you know from your own zoning codes, lots of times a zoning code will say 40,000 acres, which instead of 43,000 and change. That's why we have 0.92 here rather than rounding up to 1 acre. Almost half of our primary residential land has 2 acre or more zoning. That's crazy, but we didn't know that until we did the zoning map. There are other reasons that are maybe specific to Connecticut. We are the lowest, the state with the worst housing production, even over the pandemic, where we saw housing starts up 17% year over year. They were down in Connecticut 30%, dead last. We also have in Connecticut, and I think you might in Rhode Island too, an aging population. So the bell curve or the distribution of age has been moving up. And that's a serious problem if we want to grow our economy. So in thinking about all of these issues and thinking about political feasibility for a first-time campaign, we honed in on a number of ideas, and we called them our legislative platform for this year. We looked at we included accessory dwelling units, model codes, reduced parking mandates, commissioner training, Main Street parking and transit-oriented, Main Street housing rather, and transit-oriented development. I want to start with accessory dwelling units, and I'll just touch on each of these really briefly so that we can have a lot more time for Q&A. Our zoning atlas revealed that, so we logged where ADUs were allowed, and we also logged the characteristics associated with them. Where ADUs are allowed at all is shown on the left. Where they are allowed without what I would consider onerous requirements, like for public hearings, requirements that it be family or employees only, bans on renters and so on, is shown on the right. So accessory dwelling units, while moving in the right direction here in Connecticut, are actually fairly limited by the towns. So our proposal is that they be legalized as of right, which means without a public hearing, staff approval, that they be allowed in detached or attached housing, attached structures, and that they come with only one maximum of one minimum parking space. The way that we've introduced the legislation and our concepts, towns can still regulate architectural standards, short-term rentals, and owner occupancy. These, as you probably know from your own research, increase property values by up to 50%. And actually all multifamily housing, as we show on our FAQs page, that has been studied, has been shown to increase single family housing values. So reducing parking mandates is another one. So again, if you work in a town, you probably know what your minimum parking requirements are. We catalog that for every district in the state. We found that a good starting point for our proposal would be to cap at 1 the minimum parking required by a town for a studio or 1-bedroom apartment, and to cap at 2 parking spaces for 2 bedrooms or more. We do have towns that require 3 parking spaces for a studio apartment. Those tend to be the very wealthy towns with the higher parking requirements for apartment buildings, some of which have no parking requirements for single family housing. A statewide model form-based code is on our agenda as well. Rhode Island has a statewide planning office, and they do a great job. In Connecticut, we have no statewide planning office, so really no way to distribute best practices across different towns. Our idea is that Connecticut's building stock is very similar from one town to another. If we can start towns on the path of adopting sort of templates for the way they zone, much like Hartford has, we have a full form-based code here. We think that that will push more towns to allow for housing as of right, as opposed to subjecting it to public hearing requirements. So right now, again, single family housing is freely allowed. 2, 3, and 4 family housing, which we've documented each one of those categories and where they're allowed. Those types of housing are not typically allowed as of right. They're mostly not allowed as of right, or in many cases, as you saw from the slides, not allowed at all. So our idea is that by providing this resource, we will help towns to be able to move in the direction of approving housing in particular more quickly. Right now in the legislative session, we have a proposal that has been voted out of the committee. It does not include 2 of our, I think, most important provisions. One is developing housing around transit. We propose 4 units of housing around transit hubs, that those be, that towns choose where they are zoned. We also had a proposal where 2 to 4 family housing would be developable or zoned to be built around a main street that the towns over 7,500 or more can recommend. There's a number of other proposals on sewage, on traffic, on commissioner trainings that are in the bill, and we consider all of the proposals as a package as a first step. We have been really pleased at the public support for zoning reform. And I think it's in large part due to the fact that people are connecting freeing housing of onerous requirements to making it easier to build more housing, which in general, study after study has shown reduces prices, helps to create different housing options, and generally creates a more inclusive state. So testimony in favor of SB 1024 was overwhelmingly positive. We've done polls, lots of people support transit-oriented development. We've had a ton of op-eds in favor. We know from our research and research that our partner organizations have put out that there are tremendous benefits of zoning reform financially, that there are benefits to property owners as well. And for all of those reasons, we really do see a tide turning here. We've seen editorials from the Fairfield County papers, from The Day, which is closer to your part of the state in New London, op-eds all over the state in small town papers and in the larger papers as well. And so I'll just conclude with a quick slide on lessons from for you guys. The number one, collect data. And so I know that you guys have a ton of information that's been collected by your statewide planning office and by your statewide organizations, but doubling down on that and being able to tell a story by the data you collect is would be really valuable. I've actually been working with some other researchers and talking about a national zoning data set. If Rhode Island wanted to start documenting, like we have, the same kinds of housing characteristics in the zoning code, we'd have 2 states towards the 50, and in fact, probably 2 of the states where every inch of land is zoned. I would guess that in Rhode Island, but I'd love to learn more about that. I would also say for people who are interested in starting a conversation like this in Rhode Island, think of zoning reform as a campaign. It could be a campaign of the Rhode Island chapter of the American Planning Association, but you'd need a lot more than planners to really get the kind of momentum that we've seen here and get it out into the public consciousness that this is an area that's ripe for reform and long overdue at that. I would also turn around what I call the one-size-fits-all arguments of opponents to zoning reform, and they say, oh, this is a top-down statewide approach. I think the message really is Connecticut and Rhode Island have predominantly one size fits all zoning. It's single family zoning on large lots. And again, I'd love to know if I'm wrong, and maybe Rhode Island is a multifamily housing zoning mecca, but I predict that your characteristics are pretty similar to Connecticut's. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I really appreciate your time and love to take questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Fabiola, did you want to make any remarks, or did you want me to just kick off? Do we have any questions in the Q&A yet?
Yes, I just want to remind everyone to either use the Q&A function to ask your questions, or you can use the chat feature. We already see one question from Josh, and his question is, should a statewide progressive zoning reform effort go forward and be framed as an attempt at equity / desegregation, or as an attempt at affordable housing reform?
So I'm sure, as is the case in Connecticut, Rhode Island has some longstanding affordable housing advocates. So you probably have, as we've had here, people going to the Capitol every year with a housing agenda, framing it as an affordable housing conversation. I think what is different this year is the opportunity to link their work and their robust efforts, again, here in Connecticut, and I'm sure in Rhode Island as well, over many years, to what many people are feeling emotionally right now, which is what kinds of tangible things can I do to address the crushing inequality that I see on TV every single night when I turn on the nightly news. What is it that I can do? And I don't know that a strict, the phrase affordable housing, it seems to be, it doesn't connect with people, I think, as much. We've had some speakers come in, not through our organization, but actually through the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. Some speakers come in and talk about that particular phrase, affordable housing, and how, for whatever reason, it turns many people off. It doesn't engage them. It makes them think of more of a policy, maybe conversation. And so for us anyway, to lift up their work, we found that this framing, for whatever reason, has become, as I said from the beginning, really a lightning rod. It has brought negative attention to what most planners would think are very common sense zoning reforms. And it has led to politicians claiming segregation doesn't exist. You heard some of those talking points earlier this week on a national scale. So that has come out, but in a way, exposing that and teasing that out underscores why some of the affordable housing advocates have not always met their goals. They haven't, people have objected to affordable housing on the basis of, on other bases, maybe more technical bases. I think in some ways the opponents having the guts, I don't know, the chutzpah, I don't know what the word is, to say outlandish things like segregation is not real, has actually helped us to expose more the problem and hopefully help us address it.
Just out of curiosity, so instead of the term affordable housing, have you been hearing about like any alternative term that won't really turn people off? Just out of curiosity.
So when it comes to the policies, things like housing diversity or diverse housing options is the phrase that was mostly suggested. And it's the phrase that we've used most often as well.
Okay.
Abundant housing supply is another, or abundant housing is another kind of framing.
Another question from Josh is that he says, should planners lead the effort in educating community leaders about the history of segregated land use, or skip the history lesson?
No, this history lesson is absolutely essential. You would be surprised at how few people actually make that link between housing policy, including zoning, and the segregated America that we live in today. We have found that even when we repeat, and I didn't do it for you because not only because of the video, but because you're professional planners, and I hope you know that history. But we have found in many cases that if we go into a community without saying anything about the links, if I just went in and started talking about ADUs, and they provide housing options, and it's for the elderly, it's for low-income people, it's for the essential workers in your town, and so on, it completely, there's a disconnect between why are you talking about this, and isn't this just a is this something else that you're talking about, unless you go through that history. Again, you'd be surprised at how many people, including elected officials, have no idea about this, even when they've been in the Capitol for decades.
Oh, I believe it. I think like even as planners, like the education system for planners also needs to be looked at, because me personally, I didn't learn about redlining in my master's program. It wasn't until afterwards. So there's still schools that aren't really focused on that.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just say my day job is a law professor, and this semester for property law, I started where I've never taught property law like this before. Of course, it was all remote, but I have 70 students. I mean, normally I teach about the rule against perpetuities, and this is what a covenant is, and this is what an easement is. But this class, it just really struck me, having gone through this engagement effort and this advocacy work over the last year, at how few people understood. So my property law class started with slavery, which after all was the source of property before the Civil War. We started with that difficult topic. We talked in every single class about how property law, whatever the topic of the day was, how property law has contributed to inequality. I mean, you can name any property law topic, and I can tell you exactly how that has reinforced the vast wealth transfers from Black to white people, or Black and brown people to white people. I ended the class with a conversation on Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations, as well as the commission report for the Tulsa massacre. So I really feel it is our responsibility as educators, yours as planners, to just say, if I'm not going to do this, if I didn't do that in property law, those students would not have gotten any of this unless they took critical race theory. Well, they're required to take my class. So I have an opportunity, and I feel like a responsibility, to talk about these issues in a way I haven't before. So I would definitely encourage you as planners to take that seriously. I mean, you have you have education, even if you didn't get it in school. Hopefully you're getting it now. You see it even more clearly now. You know things that most people don't. So I encourage you to go out and do more.
For sure. Another question, and I just want to remind folks, if you could please use the Q&A function. So another question is, they said, how might these changes in policy be integrated into the rhetoric of pandemic prevention or from a community health initiative?
So a lot of what our proposals were about, again, and these were just very initial proposals, was creating a housing diversity, diverse housing options, smaller scale housing, alternatives to single family housing, essentially, in places where people could walk to resources, and eliminating minimum parking requirements actually has a tremendous equity dimension, because what parking requirements do is it just as one example, what parking requirements do is they force land to be developed in a way that prioritizes car infrastructure. parking infrastructure is sort of a vicious cycle where the more parking you provide, the more people will drive because the easier it is for them to use their cars. The less parking you provide, if you're in downtown Providence, you're not going to drive from your office building to lunch. You're going to walk because it's just a lot easier. It's such a hassle to move your car. So it's that kind of shift that we think, will have both health dimensions, because if we are walking, if we're not using our cars so much, we are going to be using our bodies more to move, which is healthier. But also, again, equity dimensions. I think the pandemic has exposed, and we'll see as these eviction moratoria are lifted, it's really exposed just the housing inequalities and the cost of housing. In Connecticut, 1/6 of our population is spending more than 50% of their income on housing, and that was before the pandemic. So imagine what's going on now. So the case to accelerate housing production is really in a combination of all of those factors. But I think the way that we do it can promote better health outcomes through the kinds of strategies that I was just talking about.
Great, thank you. Another question. Okay, okay. I love this question because this is why we're here. He said, as a volunteer commissioner in my state, how do I go about getting better educated? I am new to planning, and I find that there was little to no training.
Yeah, so this is a great question too, and there is a huge gap in for people like you in terms of the training that they should be getting, and I mean, really the impact of the decisions that you're making, because land use commissioners, they dictate by their rules and their decisions the economic growth of a community. They dictate where every single thing can be located within a community. And these decisions have vast economic consequences, not just for your community, for the state, for the country. Researchers have done research on the cost of restrictive zoning nationally. And with all of these local commissions, with commissioners who don't have adequate training, we're losing billions of dollars annually in just economic growth, because instead of being able to build housing, instead of being able to build mixed use developments, what we see is red tape delays, public hearings, vetoes, and so on. So that's not to say that we shouldn't engage in robust community planning, but it is to say that zoning should be a tool to meet our planning goals. It shouldn't be used as a tool to thwart development. So for you, Delmetrius, I would say you're welcome. We have a lot of resources on our website. It's desegregate.ct.org. We have a lot of videos. Some are specific to our legislation, but others are more general. I would encourage you to look at the high quality programming that the Rhode Island APA provides, but also see if commissioners in your town might be able to petition your staff to ask for training. Here in Connecticut, we also have a Land Use Commissioners Academy. You're welcome to join those sessions. I'm sure they would love to have you. And it's a full day of what your legal responsibilities are, how to run a public meeting, what not to say at a public meeting, in addition to the substantive aspects of zoning decision making. So there's stuff out there. And again, I encourage you to work with your staff and local planners on more.
Awesome, thank you. And I apologize, I assumed his pronoun. Another question is, how did your organization go about connecting the various organizations to your mission? Were there any roadblocks? If so, how did you overcome them?
So we actually started with a critical mass of about 20 organizations that just very organically contacted us to get involved. I happen to have my own personal, interests span of a broad spectrum. So some people just called me up and said, what are you guys doing? Other people heard other coalition members were joining and they wanted to chime in and help develop the legislative strategy and the campaign. At a certain point, we were able to then go out and ask members if they were interested in reviewing what we were doing and join us. One example of that is the Carpenters Union. We went and presented to their board and said, this is really about creating jobs for you. And actually they linked it to the fact that many of their members were unable to find quality housing, many of the carpenters in their unions. So they were pushed further and further out from work sites. And so not only did they view it as, of course, a jobs creator, but also viewed it from the equity dimension, thinking that if we had more 2 to 3 family homes, more of our members would be able to get started on that path to home ownership, where the second and third unit enable rental income that allows them to pay the mortgage. So again, many of the later coalition members came from us just saying, this is what we're doing. Are you interested in it? And we were very grateful that so many participated.
Great, thank you. Another question is, it says, thanks for the great presentation. Clearly the big problem here is the politics. Could you expand on the political initiatives in Connecticut that have helped move the process forward?
Yeah, I think with such a broad coalition and with so much that went into our research, it would, we have become a little bit hard to ignore, I guess. So, if you're interested in starting such an effort in Rhode Island, I think that's something that you should think about. How do we become an inevitable topic in the legislative session or in Providence or whatever it is you're focused on? It's really, and so with that said, as I said from the beginning, there was pushback, I think mostly related to our framing and our name. That's where the pushback has come from. If you look at, I always try to be politically sensitive here. If you look at the messages that are put out by opponents, they are very transparent about what it is they really mean when they're saying the things that they're saying. So again, that I think has been somewhat of a roadblock, but again, it's also exposed how many of our decision makers and how many of our local advocates and local leaders don't really have a good understanding about the grasp of reality. So I would say the politics can be tricky. That said, in other states like Massachusetts, zoning reform, including transit-oriented development, just passed unanimously in the Massachusetts legislature. It was a bipartisan issue. So it's really going to be very specific to your state, I think, how it actually plays out on the ground.
Thank you. Another question is, do you see the federal eviction moratorium expiration as a possible opportunity for creating new conversations about housing equity and choice?
For sure. Yeah, I think I think it's going to, again, it's going to be impossible to ignore the consequences of lifting those moratoria. That's the bottom line. You're just not going to be able to ignore the fact that once those moratoria are lifted, you're going to see many, many people who are homeless. So.
Great.
So I think, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say there's a tremendous need for this. Even if the pandemic had never happened, even if our housing prices have not been skyrocketing, even if inequality was not exposed, these are long-standing issues, and they really all relate to how easy it is for housing to be developed in any particular jurisdiction.
Another question, it says, you mentioned that collecting data was one of the first points in initiating zoning reform. Do you all have a template of data to start aggregating? I am in Kansas, and I would love to see this in my state. In my state, they are initiating a statewide housing study, the first in 30 years. I would like to mention that this is a roundtable discussion next month.
Yes, so if you go to the page that I just linked, desegregate.org/atlas, you'll see a link to a paper, and it has a section on methodology. Check out that section and you can see everything that we collected, but you can also feel free to email us, and I'll just put our email in the chat, and someone will get back to you if you need more detail. But that explains what everything we gathered was and kind of how we defined it. And if Kansas is doing it and Rhode Island is doing it, then I think we'll really have, although Kansas has a lot of unincorporated land and probably a lot of unzoned land, but the key is collecting the GIS data that has zoning district information. Because what we did was we tied information about individual zoning districts to GIS data that enables you to now see in the atlas how every piece of land is accurately zoned.
So there's no more question in the Q&A, but I did get a question in my email that I want to ask. So this particular person said that their town is perceived as a wealthy town, but it's very segregated. And when they're trying to bring the issue, they are often met with resistance. So how do you educate people to open up their eyes to see the issue, pretty much?
We've had a successful series done by one of our partners, the Fairfield County Coalition on Housing Opportunity. If you just look up this acronym, you'll find them. They've worked with individual towns to get speakers from individual towns, from the communities, and do This Town Talks Housing, so Ridgefield Talks Housing series. And they're billed as a get to know you on the issue of housing. Many people don't even realize that people in their own communities are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. They don't know what the housing supply looks like across your state. Even just very basic understanding of the state of housing is really how they start. And then they get it further into, as they do more in that series with the town, they get more into the deeper issues that we've accelerated to today, given your background knowledge. So that's a great model.
Great, thank you. We do have another question in Q&A. Is there a place for single family housing or large lot housing? And if so, where does it fit in? Isn't there a benefit to having higher density housing near economic centers and lower density in rural areas for sustainability and infrastructure reasons?
So if you think about single family housing on large lots, that is what has created sprawl. That is what requires municipalities to build more roads to reach one family than they build to reach multifamily housing. Large lot zoning has led to more asphalt. It's led to more stormwater runoff. It leads to people developing woodland areas and developing farmland and sprawling outward, because that is the only thing that they're allowed to build. If on half of our residential land, we are requiring 2-acre minimums, that's not enough for a farm. That's not enough for anything but a house. So we're forcing people to drive and drive and drive. That's what's killing our environment. That's what's driving up emissions. And that is it's a very outdated way to develop. So, I mean, we've never said as a coalition that we're out to eliminate single family zoning. But as we continue the conversation about where zoning reform should go, the idea of the need for a 2-acre minimum lot size, when in most places outside of the Northeast, minimum lot sizes are 4,000 square feet, a tenth of an acre, 5,000 square feet, at most 10,000 square feet. That's considered a very large lot in most of the rest of the country. What we have here in our part of the world is actually the most conducive to sprawl, which is worst for our environment.
Thank you.
So we don't have any more questions in the Q&A. So we're gonna hop into some questions that we've prepared. But before we do that though, I'm just wondering, just out of curiosity, what is the percentage of non-white residents in Connecticut? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, well, I know it for specific towns, and actually our zoning atlas has that figure for specific towns, but I don't have the percentage offhand. I'm sure somebody can Google it pretty quickly.
Okay, I was just wondering. So we can go into our questions. Annette, do you want to start?
Sure. And I do want to acknowledge one more popped up in the Q&A, but I'm going to go with ours for the moment. And it's a burning question now that you've answered all these other ones so thoroughly, which is thinking that zoning itself does not desegregate communities, right? It's not a magic wand, right? So what are the complementary pieces that actually get to desegregation itself?
Well, certainly subsidies for homeownership units, subsidies for new homeownership in either single family or multifamily settings in places where there's opportunity, rental expansion of rental subsidies. If you look at Europe, just as one example, the number of people who live in project-based subsidy buildings as well as voucher accepting housing arrangements is many times the amount of people that we support in with that kind of investment from the public realm. So I think subsidies on all fronts is something that's essential. The other thing is making it easier for people to access financing. Although we don't have redlining now, we in name, we certainly have it in effect. So you do see banks that are refuse to lend in urban areas or devalue and lowball appraisals for minority communities. Reform of all of that is needed in order to make sure that Black and brown families can accumulate and access wealth, and that zoning reforms that enable housing to be built actually result in housing to be built.
Thank you very much. Could you give us a sense of how you were able to build the coalition and those relationships, especially for those of us in other places that really want to emulate this?
Yeah, again, as I said, it was really organic. We did not even anticipate being a coalition when we first started. We just thought we were doing a conversational event. So it was really organic, and I have to just credit people for being willing to listen and willing to hear what it is we were trying to say.
Thank you. And do you have any case studies of the communities in Connecticut who have really stepped up and are doing the hard work?
So we do have on our newsletter, which feel free to sign up for, we have been spotlighting a community every week. So for example, this week we spotlight, actually we did Hartford for the first time, even though we've been going on for so many months. We did a project called Bracket Knoll, which is broken ground and they're under construction, but it's 2-unit housing that would enable for, it's a homeownership project, 2-unit housing that is primarily that model that I mentioned, where the homeowner is getting income from the second unit and in that way is able to pay the mortgage.
Awesome. A question in the Q&A. What are your thoughts on floating zoning and its effect on neighborhoods that are near it?
I mean, floating zoning is really just another way to say a new zone that's being, or new zoning characteristics that are being put on a neighborhood. So just like any district, a floating zone can be good or it can be bad. And it in any case has to go through a rezoning process in order to land in any particular neighborhood.
And another question that we had is, working with smaller communities tend to be, a little difficult when it comes to these conversations. So how are you working with the rural and smaller communities to get the message out?
We've primarily been in smaller, we've been in some pretty small communities. I'm going to say primarily, but we've been asked by usually when we go to the last small community we went to was Hebron, Connecticut, which is a pretty small town. And they have a coalition on social equity and diversity, and they asked us to come join them. So they arranged it, they publicized the event, and we just had a conversation with them about zoning issues. So it was, again, it's really organic. We have not had the bandwidth to really plan this all out. We go, when a small town asks us to come visit them, we do. But as I said, it seems to be primarily from sort of the groups that emerged after last summer to address issues of injustice in their towns, and they take a lot of different forms. Some of them are city commission, town commissions. Some of them are ad hoc groups. Some of them are book clubs. Milford, well, we visited the book club there, and it was great too. So it's, again, very organic.
Great. And we have one last question on our list. And as always, folks, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. So our last question is, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you first started this whole process?
I wish we had talked more about what as of right means. And that sounds like a really obscure topic, but basically, because people who are hearing our proposals wanted to find something to object to, they latched onto this phrase as of right to mean that the state legislature was going to allow developers to build skyscrapers in their towns. There is a professional planner in Fairfield County who has repeatedly said that condos will be raining down from the sky. So this is an example of someone who, either didn't read the legislation or intentionally misinterpreted it, because he's a planner as well. But it just illustrates that that particular phrase has been misconstrued by people who want to oppose these proposals. And I would have addressed, either change the phrase in the legislation or address that issue, hammer hard that this means in accordance with the town's regulations that you, the town, adopt. It just means that staff approves this kind of housing, just like they do single family housing in your town. So that's, again, it's a little wrinkle, but I think it's really important.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions in the Q&A? I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So Annette, do you want to take it away?
Sure, nor do I, but my brain is buzzing and I look forward to reaching out directly to Desegregate Connecticut as I proceed with some work that I'm doing here locally in my own town, city, as well as the professional work for Housing Works Rhode Island. I just want to, close first by letting participants know that there will be an email following up this program, which asks you to fill out our survey. We really rely on your input on how to create content, especially for the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, because we are committed to bringing valuable programs such as this, which touches on sometimes difficult topics. Thank you to all the members of the Rhode Island APA EDI Committee, especially our chair, Fabiola, who's been doing such great work for us all, late night emails and such, and the assistance of Rhode Island's statewide planning division with help in setting us up today for this. We're very, very grateful to Sara Bronin for providing this real world example of a neighboring state attacking the legacy of segregation head on. I have to tell you, Sara, as somebody who's gone to those towns and done affordable housing, said those things all the time, I don't know that I really have ever, thought in terms of framing it as I am here to desegregate your town. And that certainly is a way to separate the wheat from the chaff. I have to say, I think that would be doing
we don't necessarily go in like that, but it has been a starting point for conversation, and that's sure what people need right now. They need to understand, how these issues are linked. And so, yeah. I'm
profoundly grateful. So, as the disproportionate racial and ethnic impact of COVID-19 made all too apparent, not all Rhode Islanders have the same access to healthy, affordable homes and economic well-being. The United States history of redlining, as well as the other practices detailed in the documentary, has created patterns of racial and ethnic segregation that align with housing availability across many states. While there is no longer de jure segregation, de facto segregation exists in access to a diversity of homes that parallels our diversity of community, including by age, as well as race and ethnicity, family composition, etc. Rhode Island is not unique in this fact, as illustrated by the common relegation of multifamily homes to a dense urban ring around many of our nation's cities. Not surprisingly, Rhode Island's regional, racial, and ethnic makeup correlate with that housing landscape. A 2017 analysis by the Rhode Island Economic Progress Institute found that 80% of Black Rhode Islanders live in only 6 of our 39 municipalities. With new reasons and opportunities to examine our state's connections to community well-being, we urge discussions at all levels of community and government to prompt solutions to housing availability that is consistent with our values as a state and country. Thank you to all who attended today and asked questions in what seems like an unendingly historic time. I am not sure there is a greater challenge before us all, both professionally and personally. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Fabiola. Thank you, everyone who attended.
Thank you, Annette. And there's a comment in the chat. Sorry, I can't.
To log your AICPCM credits for this session at
Yes,
the APA national website.
yes. Thank you,
Goodbye,
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.